Hello, it's great to be here. While Australia is a large country, our population density is low, so gatherings of other coast and estuarine specialists are quite small events. Here is a slide with my details. My time zone is very different to yours, but I enjoy keeping in contact with conference participants. If you have any questions or ideas, please find me on LinkedIn or send me an email. The Coorong is the estuary of the River Murray in South Australia. The river itself is the third longest navigable river in the world. However, the volume of water that passes along it is quite low compared to many of the American rivers I visited pre-COVID. The Lakes and Coorong Wetland Complex is Australia's largest wave-dominated estuary and is the traditional lands or rui of the Narrandjeri, the people. The wetland includes two relatively freshwater lakes separated from the rest of the estuary by barrages, with 90 miles of interconnected coastal lagoons on the seaward side of those barrages, connected to the sea via a very small mouth at the northern end. The South Lagoon is the most distant lagoon from the mouth, with its northern end 38 miles south of the river's outlet to the sea. The South Lagoon is connected to the North Lagoon by a single channel, just 127 yards wide. However, the lagoon itself is 32 miles long, 2.5 miles wide, and presently looks like the images here. I was brought in by local landholders and fishermen who are having trouble reconciling the South Lagoon of today, littered with abandoned fishermen's shacks and generating so much hydrogen sulfide gas that it wakes them up on hot summer's nights, with their forebears' accounts of the lagoon hosting a booming fishery. Being a remote region, the local farmers and fishers are often hesitant to engage with authority. However, on matters Coorong, this reluctance is compounded by the conflicting and passionately held beliefs of visiting professors, agency staff and politicians who all have conflicting views on the cause of the problem, or even if there is one. Non-residential stakeholders have variously claimed that the South Lagoon was historically hypersaline or completely fresh, and that its decline is entirely due to the drainage of wetlands to the south or due to hyper-extraction from the River Murray. There never seems to be a middle ground, apart from agreement that the South Lagoon is, for various reasons, largely unfixable. Despite the community's usual hesitation to engage with formal processes, they enthusiastically agreed to partner with Federation University, effectively crowdsourcing the funding for an industry sponsorship of my PhD candidature. Never one to say no to a passionate community initiative, my last 2 years have been spent combing through historic records, trying to determine what this place functioned like at different points of time and how it has come to be like this. The wetlands to the south of the Coorong were colonised in the 1840s during an exceptionally dry period, during which the settlers cleared and cropped areas that would have otherwise been wetlands. By 1860, normal rains had filled up the landscape and demands were made for the first drains and banks, commencing only a few short years later. After 6 royal commissions prior to 1901, drainage construction really took off, continuing through the 1900s. There are now over 1,600 miles of government-operated drains, with an untold length of on-farm feeder drains. It was, and continues to be, one of the largest engineering projects ever undertaken in South Australia. The duration of this project and the constant successive changes makes identifying how much of this water used to run into the Coorong from the southern portion of the state very challenging. However, conservative estimates are that 350 to 600 gigalitres most likely discharged from Salt Creek, which is the main drainage line into the Coorong. In contrast, by the 1990s, there was effectively no water coming down Salt Creek, with the work being done to correct this. In total, 2 decades of flow restoration has returned up to 50 gigalitres on a wet year from the parched and dried out catchment. The decrease in Murray River flows is also undeniable. Prior to 1903, flows through the Murray Mouth averaged 14,000 gigalitres per year, while they are now less than a seventh of that. This is despite numerous acts and plans by the Commonwealth Government and states to ensure better water management. As forecast in a letter to the editor in 1935, these decreased flows, along with the land management changes, have led to increased sand deposition around the mouth of the estuary. This has resulted in the mouth shifting from being permanently open to requiring constant dredging. This has dramatically reduced seawater interchange. Water quality testing conducted by various researchers from 1950 through to the present day, when combined, is providing some useful insights regarding the roles of each of these changes. The overall salinity in the South Lagoon has shifted, with carbonates in sediment cores becoming dominated by inorganic rather than biogenic sources. Most lines of evidence examined to date suggest that the South Lagoon prior to these impacts had a highly variable salinity which fluctuated spatially and temporally from half seawater salinity to twice seawater salinity. This same water body now spends extended periods of time entirely at more than twice seawater salinity. Even extreme flood events like the 1956 flood only appear to have short-term impacts on the salinity of the South Lagoon, potentially due to the timing and the lack of mixing between fresh and hypersaline waters. While the 1956 flood freshened the lagoon and helped reset the ecology, the South Lagoon appears to depend on regular flows from Salt Creek, from groundwater soaks and seawater inputs, to regulate its long-term salinity. The comparison of three major ions within the South Lagoon water, shown here, using two data sets 40 years apart, shows a clear shift towards a system influenced by sulfate cycling rather than the historic system that had a higher portion of calcium and magnesium, suggesting that the water body was strongly influenced by the carbonate cycle. Work published by another PhD candidate just last month, looking at strontium isotopes in sediment cores, suggests that 15 to 45% of the current water in the South Lagoon comes from the southeast wetland complexes and groundwater, whereas this percentage was potentially more than 60% prior to drainage. This interpretation of historic water quality data is backed up by the accounts of biota in the South Lagoon from the 1840s to present. While declines in aquatic South Lagoon habitats were observed as early as 1907, it wasn't until the 1960s when concerns regarding the declining habitat values in this area started attracting significant research effort. Sadly, as forecast by the President of the Royal Society of South Australia in 1891, the effect of the colonisers' hand on the landscape was felt long before there was any scientific attempt to characterise it, despite the science of natural history being well enough advanced to do so. This slide gives an initial visual reconstruction of what this area may have looked like pre-colonisation. Although the water was always too saline for stock to drink, or be used for irrigation, the aquatic habitats present over this earlier period were highly productive. The sediments were generally firmer and calcium-rich. The aquatic areas were dominated by stonewort and calcium weed forests, often growing so fast that they would generate up to 400 grams per square metre of calcium carbonate and organic-rich sediments every year. These underwater forests were troublesome for boats, but were excellent habitat and food sources for fish and birds. Deeper areas dominated by lush perennial rupia stands and shallower sandbanks were home to annual rupia and mudcockles. Founder made circular holes in the weeds as they fed, and the congolia were a common fish. One of the largest black brim fisheries in Australia operated from the tiny hamlet of Salt Creek at the southern end of the South Lagoon, with fish such as yellow-eyed mullet and an occasional mulloway coming in when the connectivity with the rest of the Coorong was open. The connectivity with the rest of the wetland was always a matter of contention. There are records throughout the early 1900s of the connection between the two main lagoons almost entirely drying out over summer, leaving the South Lagoon as an isolated water body for a month or two during the driest periods. There are engineering solutions proposed as early as 1872 when it was proposed to dredge the connecting channel to allow for navigation. Some liked the fact that the South Lagoon was somewhat separate to the rest of the Coorong, with the fisheries inspector observing in 1906 that the issues with navigation in the South Lagoon, for both fishermen and predatory fish, resulted in lower fishing pressure, leading to the area being far better stocked with desirable species. All of these issues and trends discussed today look complicated, but they do tie together. As shown by this fish diagram, one issue drives another. The combined changes in water sources in the South Lagoon have driven changes in the ionic balance, salinity and nutrients within the water body. This has, in turn, led to changes in sediment type, accumulation rate and distribution. The increased salinity, or lack of low salinity events, along with a lack of available carbonates, has led to the loss of stonewort, calcium weed and perennial rupia forms. Without more complex vegetation types, phytoplankton and bacteria have become dominant, causing periods of anaerobia, which, combined with the initial drivers, has led to an almost complete loss of all but the most resilient aquatic macroinvertebrates. This has had a distinct and predictable impact on the animals at higher trophic levels, including the fish and the birds. I'd like to finish with a reminder of why truly long-term monitoring is critical. Without knowing what we once had, we will have no idea of what we lost, what direction things are currently going in, the prices we have paid, or what we could have again sometime in the future.